Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for attending the 70th episode of the Clements Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. Just a couple of quick reminders about how we use Zoom for our programs. We're happy to have you chime in. Please change the setting to include everyone. You can use the Q&A section to ask questions and to upvote questions that you also would like answered. I have the live machine captioning turned on, and you can toggle that on or off or change the size. And please play around with side-by-side mode so that you see everything as best you can for your particular device. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of history and culture of North America and the Caribbean to 1900. I would like now to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabeg ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library also acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and the established hierarchies of settler colonialism. So thank you so much for clicking on today's poll question, which obviously we'll be talking about more during today's presentation. And the answer is 10% of the Union Army enlisted before age 18. So thank you. It looks like about 44% of you guessed or knew that fact. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. Now it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome today's guests. Francis M. Clarke is Associate Professor of History at the University of Sydney. Professor Rebecca Jo Plant is Professor of History at the University of California, San Diego. Together, they authored Of Age, Boy Soldiers and Military Power in the Civil War Era, which won the 2024 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize, as well as the 2024 Grace Abbott Book Award from the Society for the History of Children and Youth. Their work on this book was supported by the Australian Research Council and the ACLS. We are so lucky to have presenters joining us from around the world. And so because of the time difference in Sydney, Australia, Professor Clarke has provided us with a video. After the video, Professor Plant will give additional commentary and have a conversation with Paul Erickson, the Randolph G. Adams Director of the Clements Library.
Hi everyone, my name's Frances Clarke. I'm Rebecca's co-author. Sorry that I can't be there today in person, but I think it's going to be the middle of the night in Australia when you're meeting, so a recording we'll have to do. I'll talk for about 15 minutes and then I'll hand you over to Rebecca to talk some more. I'll just discuss a few of the book's major themes and talk about the story that we're telling in our book. So in very simple terms, this is a book about the enormous numbers of boy soldiers who served in the Civil War and the many consequences that flowed from their service, consequences that were political, military, medical, legal. We start out by noting that about 10% of the Union Army was underage. I can let Rebecca tell you in the question time how we reached that figure. Today, I'll just start out by addressing the question of why there were so many underage youths. The most, in this war in particular, the most obvious answer is, of course, that people in this period didn't see anything wrong with young people serving in the military. They enlist boys from about the age of 12 as musicians. They've done that for many decades. They've long enlisted in the US boys in the Navy at around the age of 10 or 11 as, to serve as cabin boys or powder monkeys or other roles. Similarly, Americans have a long militia tradition that dates back to the colonial era, where all white males were charged with the defence of their communities. So, after the Revolution, they pass a law that says that, if you're above the age of 18, you have to serve in the militia. Even then, though, sometimes boys younger than that would turn out with their fathers or their older male relatives, and there's the rise of volunteer regiments in the 19th century, and boys younger than 18 were joining these as well. There are also some less obvious explanations for mass underage enlistment in this era, though. One of them lies in demography. The US population in the mid-19th century is incredibly youthful, as you can see from these slides. More than half the population in the 1860s is under the age of 20. The medium age back then is 19.1. Today, the medium age is 38.1. And as you can see from this other population chart, those who are under 20 constitute less than a quarter of the population. So there's a lot more young people living in America in that period. The nature of people's working lives was also I think, helped to ensure mass underage enlistment. Almost everyone was working above about the age of 10 in the mid-19th century. In the 1850s and 1860s, census takers were told to record a trade, occupational profession for everyone above the age of 15. So in other words, by the time you reached the age of 16, you were considered a sort of full able-bodied worker. In a context in which almost everyone's working by necessity, signing up for military service didn't seem like a bad job prospect for the young. You get a pretty decent wage. You get a full adult wage as a minor, which is, not easy to get. You get, regular medical care. You get regular food, not very nice food, but regular. You might get a bounty. You might have the possibility of upward career mobility for young men. So, it's a very volatile economic climate back then in this context. Very volatile, very hard to get sort of secure jobs. In that context, where secure jobs, well-paying jobs are scarce, it just made sense that young boys would flock to enlist because they're all workers. They're going where the money is. Most would have also seen the age limits as pretty arbitrary and unimportant because those age limits exist nowhere else in American culture in this era. Really, age is only being used as a criterion for rejecting people or accepting people in voting and office holding. Every other aspect of American life, people are mingling together in, various ages. So you might join a voluntary group or a school or whatever. You would be in a classroom or, a social event or whatever with people of all different kinds of ages. Boys joined high school or entered classrooms or common schools in their late teens, even their early 20s. You get some of them. Some boys as young as 15 or 16 are entering universities and colleges at this time, precisely because age isn't being used as a criterion in nearly every aspect of life. There's no fields yet like child psychology or pediatrics, these fields that think about, the very specific nature of childhood. Nothing like that existed in this period. And really, perhaps most importantly, boys and youths are working alongside older men on work sites where they're performing labour that's distributed based on their size, their strength, their skill, not their age. Many are working independently and they have holding huge amounts of responsibility as well. So, if you're a young male who's been, working alongside adults for many years, the military age rules would have seemed fairly nonsensical, arbitrary. And to these realities, we've got to add I just put a few slides in here to, to show that there's this very heavy, tradition in this period of lauding the boy soldier. So in short, sort of harsh economic realities, a lack of age consciousness, very high levels of independence among young males, and this huge romanticisation of boys in uniform, along with the lax enforcement of regulations, all helping to account for why underage enlistment could occur on such a mass scale. Now, all of this makes it sound as if underage enlistment is uncontentious, but in fact it's not. People might have had no moral qualms about enlisting young people in the military, but they did worry a lot about underage enlistment on two grounds. First, they worried a lot about young men's physical capacity to serve. One of our most surprising findings in the book is that military theorists had come to see the enlistment age as enormously consequential by the time of the Civil War. In fact, most people argued that boys in their late teens were lost my page, still physically developing, incapable of, performing rigorous service. So it didn't matter what they looked like on the outside. The fact is, under a certain age, they were inevitably going to break down. They would end up, breaking down on the march, clogging hospitals. The most important medical voice in this era is the US Surgeon General, William Hammond. He bluntly declares in 1863, boys do not make good soldiers. And then he goes on to suggest that they should raise the enlistment age between 20 and 22. The belief here, and he's only one of nearly every medical voice in this time was saying the same thing. And they're drawing here from these studies that have been conducted in Europe in the first half of the 19th century, where military theorists are really trying to figure out, what is the ideal enlistment age to ensure a robust military. This is another topic that Rebecca can take up if people are interested. But in addition to these medical concerns, there's another key objection to underage enlistment, this one being voiced primarily by parents. Civil War era Americans might have, raised no moral objections to the idea of children serving in the military, but they're very firmly convinced that parents had a moral and a legal right to their children's productive the productive labour and their wages. In fact, outside of slaveholding areas, parents talked about their children's productive capacity, their earning capacity, as their most important asset. And they're not exaggerating here. Most families have to pool resources to get by in this era, and the labour of boys in particular, boys sort of once they've reached their full physical maturity, that labour is the most valuable labour. So while they've got no concept of children's rights, people in this era have a very expansive understanding of parental rights. As one father who sought the discharge for his 19-year-old son explained, he's writing into the government here asking for his son back, and he says, my son's left home before, he's gone and worked in various places, but, my rights have never been threatened before, despite that fact. He says, quote, in the past, I hired him out. I took charge of his wages. I attended to his purchases. I settled his bills up to the time of his enlistment and his school bill after he left. And in all things have regarded him as only subject to my own proper guardianship and control. Right, so he's emphasising here to the government, look how much labour and time and effort and finances I've put into creating this human, and now you've simply stolen that asset, right? Putting the matter more tersely, a letter writer who described herself as a, quote, poor widow woman advanced in age, wrote in to tell the government, quote, William Abbey is a minor, I therefore consider him my property. So, these parents who are, they're not just considering the government's actions as unfair or unjust, or even unlawful, rather they're using terms like impressment or theft or kidnapping to convey their sense of sort of violated ownership when describing the military's holding of enlisted youth. The story that we're telling in our book comes out of our examination of parents' outcry over underage enlistment and the way US officials are responding to that outcry. This turned out to be a really unexpectedly difficult story to tell because we started out trying to create a timeline of rules and regulations and laws governing underage enlistment, which we thought would be pretty easy. But as soon as we started trying to do that, we realised this is a maddeningly complex thing to try and do because underage youths are provoking these sort of really protracted legal, political, administrative battles throughout the war. When Lincoln first called for troops in April 1861, the government was basically inundated with parents' petitions demanding their children back because at the start of the Civil War, a minor is defined as anyone under the age of 21. So lots and lots of, nearly most of the people entering the army were under the age of 21. Many parents wrote to say, I want my son back. At first, a lot of fathers just showed up at military camps and they appealed to officers. They said, my son is 19, I do not, or 20 or whatever, 18, 17, I don't accept his enlistment. And oftentimes in the first few months of the war, they're successful in getting their sons back. Take the case of Thomas Hines, he's a Philadelphian. He's 16. In May 1861, he hears the sound of fife and drums and he goes to a recruiting station. He puts his name down on the list and then he sleeps on the floor that night alongside other recruits. The next day, his parents come and find him and they bring him home. But a week later, he's joined a cavalry regiment and he's immediately sent to a camp in New Jersey. Again, his father goes to New Jersey and retrieves him. But within days, he is back at the same camp. This time he lies about his age, he forges his dad's signature, and he manages to get himself mustered into service. At that point, when a boy had been mustered, parents had two main avenues for redress, the legal or the administrative. Mr. Hines pursued the former. When he goes to retrieve his son for the third time, he's carrying a writ of habeas corpus and he's accompanied by a court official. In the 19th century, habeas corpus is widely revered as a means of challenging all kinds of unlawful detention. So it's used in things like child custody cases. What matters for our story is that it's a check on fraudulent or abusive enlistment practices, or what one petitioner called service impressment. Any parent could basically appeal to a local judge for a writ. If the judge granted that writ, the officer had to bring the enlistee into court so the judge could rule on the validity of the enlistment. And if the judge said, this is a fraudulent enlistment, then the enlistee is simply discharged on the spot. From our perspective, from a present day perspective, it seems the idea that state and local courts could exercise this kind of authority over the US military seems inconceivable. But this is how things worked in the mid-19th century, which was an era still very deeply shaped by the founders' deep suspicions of centralized military power. So one of the things we're doing in the book is sort of showing how that sense breaks down. In the case of Thomas Hines, the officers don't even bother appealing the writ. They just hand him over to the father because they know exactly what's going to happen. The courts are just going to release him. At home, Mr. Hines tried to reason with his son. He even promises to go himself, even though he's 50 years of age, so he's well above the legal enlistment age, if his son will just stay home. But he cannot get Thomas to stay home. Thomas ends up going back to Maryland and joining that cavalry regiment, and he serves his full 3-year term. So as this case shows, even at the beginning of the war, when remedies were available to parents, when their sons were really hell-bent on enlisting, they really had little chance of keeping them. They could find a regiment somewhere that would accept them. The other path for redress that parents could take was to appeal to the War Department following policies that predated the Civil War. They could submit a petition seeking their son's release that was accompanied by sworn affidavits. I've got a copy of one of them here. And for the first 10 months of the war, the army was legally obliged to release any minor, meaning anyone below the age of 21, who had enlisted without parental consent. This is actually not what happened, though, because the minute the war breaks out, these sorts of petitions start to just flood into the War Department. This is a case from July 1861. It's a father who's writing and demanding the release of his 19-year-old son. He's a machinist, actually, by trade, but he's fully appraised of his rights. He even, he's citing the Articles of War in this petition. It goes on for several pages. Like other 19th century scholars, we're really struck by the extent to which 19th century people in America, the extent to which the law was part of the fabric of their daily lives and their knowledge of the law. This working class guy sort of quoting the Articles of War, and this is a hysterical petition because he basically says, you've had my son for however many months they'd had them. I want compensation for the amount of time you've had my son because he's a valuable asset, right? I don't think he gets the son back, but you can see on the bottom of this petition, you can see on the left-hand side, there's a little disc down the bottom. That means he's been discharged. So the War Department has said, okay, you get the kid back. They would not have given him money for the child's many months away. But as early as 1861, the War Department has started denying requests like this because there's just so many of them. at the same time, it's imploring Congress, please change the law. In September 1861, this is a two-page letter, September 1861, finally, the War Department issues a general order that simply says, we can't let anyone else go, there will be no discharges on the grounds of minority. Congress was initially reluctant to undercut parents' authority, but it finally acts to codify developments on the ground in February 1862, which is what's on this slide. At that point, Congress passes a law that does three things in relation to underage enlistment. First, it lowered the age of enlistment without parental consent to 18. Second, it barred anyone below the age of 18 from enlisting except in the role of musician. And then finally, it threw in this sort of poison pill. It decreed that anyone, that whatever age you swore to at enlistment would be quote unquote conclusive. That means if you're 12 and you say I'm 18 or 21, which some 12-year-olds did, you just become 21 under the eyes of the law. As Assistant Attorney Attorney General E.D. Townsend later wrote, this law made it legal perjury for a man to swear falsely to his age. For parents, they're trying to put this matter of underage enlistment to rest, but the practical implications of this were pretty remarkable. Basically, minors could now emancipate themselves by lying. For parents, the implications are pretty severe. A boy, unless he'd actually given his age truthfully as 17 or 16 or whatever it was, and he'd been enlisted regardless, then the parents could no longer petition for his discharge, no matter his age. After the passage of this February 62 law, some courts abided by federal regulations and they stopped issuing writs, but many actually continued issuing writs. The majority continued to allow parents to submit petitions, even as critics increasingly portrayed the actions of these judges as unlawful and hostile. And, in some cases these were judges who were hostile to the war effort and they're letting out minors because they let anyone who comes to them for a writ. But we're arguing in the book that, many other judges are really acting on principle. They're jealously guarding a judicial prerogative that has existed since the founding of the nation, which is their right to, determine the legality of detentions. When Lincoln, sorry, I think I'm on a different slide now. Finally, in September 1863, the Lincoln administration decides it's going to lay down the law to all these recalcitrant judges. They suspend habeas corpus across the nation. Now, as many of you will know, Lincoln's suspensions of habeas corpus, he's previously issued some less sweeping, vigorously enforced suspensions. These are sort of hotly debated to this day, but the debate is typically framed as a matter of Lincoln's willingness to tolerate political dissent. And one of our book's major contributions is to show that, the anxieties concerning the preservation of military manpower are equally, if not more, central to the decision to suspend habeas corpus as, discussions of political allegiance. As the war progressed and the administration basically grew increasingly determined to shield the military from the ceaseless flow of writs that were seeking the release of individual soldiers. And as we show, most of these writs, the vast majority of them, are for underage troops. This is a shocking development to many people at the time, including many who supported the war effort. They could understand the government needing to crack down on anti-war protesters, but the idea of removing all parents' ability to retrieve a child that is run off to the military, and these cases are constantly going through the press, just seem beyond the pale to many pro-war people. Eventually, the public outcry from parents is so vociferous that in July 64, Congress is forced to pass another law, which basically required the Secretary of War to discharge anyone below 18 whose parents could prove they were 18. But there's another poison pill in here. It said, we'll discharge you, but only if you can pay back every bit of the bounty money that you've received up to this point. And of course, Rebecca can explain this in the Q&A, but we have a chapter that looks at the enforced or impressment of young boys, which is just rampant during this war. So many of them have been illegally enlisted, basically, and had their bounties stolen. So most parents could not afford to pay back hundreds and hundreds of dollars to get their children back, so their children end up staying in the military. So, when you step back and think about the complicated maneuverings of the War Department, Congress, and the courts over the course of the war, over this trying to recover underage enlistees, you see a growing centralisation of power. Even when courts open up this avenue for recovering enlistees, it's a federal avenue for redress, right? You appeal to the Secretary of War. When considered in isolation, these conflicts over underage youth seem like sort of family dramas. But when you add them all up, when you look at them in total, they constitute something more significant, we're arguing, really a struggle over the extent to which the military will be freed from the interference of local communities who are really seeking to check the military power. So I'll leave it there and I'll hand you back over to Rebecca. I hope you have a good conversation. Thank you.
Just say a few words about our conclusions and then we can launch into a discussion. So in regard to and do I sound okay? Everyone hears me okay? Yeah, okay. So in terms of the takeaways of our book, so one of the really interesting ones that does have to do with what Francis was saying about the federalization of habeas corpus and just people's relationship to the law more broadly. Again, we were really struck by how people talked about and the various ways in which they spelled in their petition habeas corpus. They basically talked about it as the great writ. It was not an esoteric concept. It was something that people understood, that they had this access to attempting to get the body of the person who was being, in their view, illegally detained. But this was a fundamental right of Americans, and it was accessible really on a local level. And when we talk about the federalization of habeas corpus, what we mean is really related to something that happens after the war. So in 1872, there's a Supreme Court case, Tarbell's case, that basically says any case in which the detainer is a federal authority, including the U.S. military, local and state judges cannot issue writs for those people. So it takes the realm of military enlistment outside of any kind of local or state oversight, right? And what's critical about this case is that it was a minor. It was a minor enlistee. Minor meaning at this point in time, it's underage 21 again. So he had enlisted at something like age 19 without parental consent. The father petitions to get him back, and they basically say that because the Civil War showed what a vast mischief parents can wreak upon the military by issuing these kinds of petitions and demands and writs, we are basically saying this is now off limits. And so, that's a pretty significant change. It's amazing how much it kind of flew under the radar. But the fact that the 1872 case not only is a case of a minor, but specifically refers back to what occurred, the chaos that occurred in the Civil War and the way in which it potentially undermined military efficiency, I think is pretty significant. You also have the more social effects of all these boys coming back after the war who had enlisted and underage, and in many cases, when they returned as veterans, they are still underage. So one of our favorite sources in the book comes from a guy named Alan Dunn in Kansas, who basically, he writes first to the Supreme Court Chief Justice, Justice Chase, and he basically says, we have military officials in our town who are causing a lot of problems by telling boys that they owe no service to their parents by virtue of their military service, essentially that they had been emancipated. And he's writing to say, what is the deal with this? And basically, the answer, which the Chief Justice would have known, is they are emancipated. Legally, they don't owe service to their parents. But he doesn't say that. Instead, he refers to the Bible, honor thy father and mother, and basically says, that nothing has occurred to make the commandment irrelevant. So he's still very upset, and he writes then to the Secretary of War and basically gets the same kind of evasive response. And so what's happening here is that the very highest ranking officials who would have been aware of the way in which military service at a federal level was emancipatory, they're not willing to really recognize what has been wrought. They don't want to acknowledge the fact that the war has had this incredibly disruptive effect on ordinary households, right? So we only can offer sort of glimpses of this throughout the book. I hope it's something that some other scholar takes up, sort of social implications of youth enlistment for the post-war period. But you can imagine they must have been significant. And then another important takeaway, I think, has to do with medical history. Francis talked about the ways in which the scholars at the time, and they're a very distinctive group of sort of military physicians who are really trying to understand how do you create the most efficient armies, and that's why they're so concerned about youth enlistment. They don't think boys are finished growing, and they don't think that they will therefore be able to stand up to the hardships of military service, even like 19, 20-year-olds. So that's a really at odds with what is actually happening on the ground. But it does show up in interesting places, this concern about the physical development of youth. One of the sources that we use pretty sparingly in the book, we're trying to figure out what to do with them now because we collected so many of them. There are these court-martial records where you get the full transcript of the court-martial, and we looked at the ones involving, of course, where age is referenced and it's clear that you're dealing with an underage boy. In these cases, very routinely, the sentencing is different, and that essentially there are these stock phrases that are used on account of that, like they're mitigating the sentence on account of youth or even on account of extreme youth. So in essence, what we concluded is that basically there's a kind of almost juvenile justice system, an informal juvenile justice system within the military justice system of the Union Army, where young people are being held to different standards. Their youth is being taken into account, even though nowhere in terms of official Army regulations does it suggest that this should be the case, right? So that's another sort of interesting one of our findings. And then, I think that thinking about the Civil War more broadly, one of the issues that we just kept coming back to, you would read a case, you have to open up the petition, they're folded into thirds, and you can read the whole case and then find out, you can usually figure out what happens, like are they let out or not. And we would be so shocked. You'd find this case of a 14-year-old. There are neighbors who provided affidavits. They are, it's really clear, even in some cases, like the military commander is like, okay, we can let this one go. And still they aren't discharged. And so we finally basically had to ask ourselves, well, what is going on here? Why are they not letting these boys out? And, you know, the parents involved, they are loyal Americans. These aren't cases of people who are already, you know, they're not suspect people from the border states who their loyalty is in question. They have often other sons in the service as well. And it just seemed like such a strange thing to alienate this body of people. And we ultimately concluded they're doing that because they need them. They actually need them. Over 80% of underage enlistees were actually 16 or 17-year-olds. So we're not talking about the 14-year-old that I just mentioned, the hypothetical 14-year-old. And that group of people is actually, you know, significant. It's large enough to make significant military contributions. So, for example, when they finally in 1864 cracked down and passed laws that are designed to, you know, really punish recruiters who are enlisting those who are below age, they only punish those who are enlisting those below 16, not even though the minimum age of enlistment is 18. So, you know, I think that ultimately what our work shows is not just the kinds of debates and changes and the windows onto the centralization of power that this topic opens up to people who are interested in the Civil War, but also just, you know, it gives us a sharper perspective on a minority of soldiers who played a crucial role in the Union victory. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for those comments and for being here today. I know it's very early where you are. So I have a few questions to talk about, and then we will go to the list of questions from the viewers. I just want to encourage everybody. This is a really, really, really good book, and there's a discount code in the chat. So I can't encourage you strongly enough to order a copy and read it. It's really fantastic. But before we get to the sort of the meat of the book, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your collaboration and work process. So you are based in San Diego. Frances lives in Sydney, Australia.
Yeah.
It's unusual for academic books to be co-authored even by people who live in the same time zone, much less on different continents. And I will say that when I worked at the American Antiquarian Society 12 years ago, we gave Frances a short-term fellowship to come work on this book. And in the proposal, I remember it described it as being a co-authored project. And in our discussion about awarding fellowships, we're like, well, how's that going to work? They live in totally different, they are in different days all the time. So how is this, how did it work? How did you work together on this book?
Well, I should say we had a long history before this book. We went to graduate school together. We had read each other's work ever since then. So we had a really solid foundation to build on. But basically, we got two significant fellowships. I moved my family to Australia. We basically had some time together at the beginning of the process that was very intensive, that allowed us to really get the project launched in terms of the actual writing. The Antiquarian Society Fellowship, that was one that I didn't go on, but we actually went to a lot of archives together. There are a few that we did separately, but you know, we sat side by side in the National Archives for weeks at a time, taking notes and sharing our findings with each other. That was kind of exciting because, as you know, when you do archival research and you find something really cool, it's like there's nobody to talk to about it usually. But there were a couple, like, the fact that Zoom had been developed, well, first Skype, we were using Skype, and then Zoom and Dropbox. Basically, when we weren't physically together, I don't think that we could have done the project without those things. Fortunately, at that point, I was a bit of a night owl. So it helped a little bit in terms of the time zone. We could usually connect in my late afternoon and work for a couple hours together. But we also would just, leave stuff for each other in the shared Dropbox, and we could sort of track what the other person had done while we were sleeping, and it just kind of have an ongoing dialogue that was on the documents, over email, over Zoom. Yeah, it worked. It actually worked, but I don't think it would have worked without, I made several trips to Australia. She made several trips to the United States, and I don't think it would have worked without intensive time in each other's company at the beginning.
Right. Right. So we have a couple questions about underage enlistment in the Confederacy, and what the findings in your book kind of, I think, run counter to what we might expect about ideas about kind of universal mobilization in the Confederacy. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes. So the Confederacy actually in 64, when things are getting pretty dire, it does lower and raise the age of enlistment. It lowers it to 17, but not for the regular Confederate Army. All the 17-year-olds were supposed to serve in state-controlled reserve units, which was pretty significantly different in terms of what service actually looked like. So that actually reflects kind of longstanding Confederate concern about youth enlistment that you actually don't see articulated much in the Union at all. And it's reflected, we title our chapter something like grinding the seed corn. This was what Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, other major Confederate figures, they speak very explicitly about the dangers of youth enlistment and the fact that, they're very aware of their demographic inferiority compared to the North, that they're at a very significant disadvantage, and they want to hold youth in reserve, not only for military purposes, but this idea that, what will happen if you lose this whole generation of young men in terms of governing after our imagined victory, right? So especially in regard to like educated, elite young men, they really try to hold them back. That we have a little discussion about, Robert E. Lee's correspondence with his son, Robert E. Lee Jr., and the son wants to enlist, the father keeps trying to put it off, and basically, that was, again, somewhat surprising to us, that at the end of the war, in part because of something that Grant says, there's this argument that gets going that the Confederacy enlisted everyone cradle to grave. And you do have people reporting seeing very young folks in uniform guarding bridges and things like that. But we ultimately concluded that, like, if an underage boy enlists without consent, it's easier to get him out of the Confederate Army than the Union Army. And habeas corpus, although Jefferson Davis does suspend habeas corpus, it's not as uniformly enforced, and the Confederate Congress doesn't doesn't extend it. So during really critical parts of the war, when he's most concerned about manpower, he actually doesn't have that authority. So it's a different situation.
Yeah. So one of the central issues that's at play in the book is the idea that in the 19th century, parents not just owned children's labor, but had could claim a really significant degree of control over their children until they turned 21. And that's what's behind all these petitions for habeas corpus. Some parents obviously were worried about what was going to happen to their children, but a lot of them, the cases that you cite, are about the value of children's labor and parents saying, we can't harvest our crops without our son. And you make pretty clear that up until children were 21, if they had a job that earned wages, those wages belonged to the parents. So can you talk a little bit, maybe in broader terms, about the idea of childhood in this period as a category of unfreedom? I mean, obviously, children are not the same as enslaved people. They do eventually, become, as the term is used, emancipated. But sort of what degree of control did children, even, people that we would consider today adults, 20, 21-year-olds, have over their own lives in the 19th century?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I think this is a real transition period, like the decades leading up to the Civil War, and then the Civil War kind of accelerates this, assault on paternal authority, really. But basically, many youths are going off to cities. They're going out west looking for opportunities before the age of majority. And I shouldn't say that a lot of states actually pass laws lowering the age of majority for women to 18. So it's really males who are, in this situation of prolonged, whatever you want to call it, dependence. But some fathers, they basically say, I have no assets to give you, but I will give you your time. And they do that at an earlier age. They emancipate their sons, basically. And I think that, I think it's probably not terribly uncommon by the time the Civil War breaks out that a lot of young people who are, especially if they're mobile, this idea of being able to control a young man only works if he's still in the household. Once he's, you can legally say that his wages you own, but it gets harder and harder to actually enforce that if he's not under your roof. And if he is actually self-supporting, then your legal claim to those wages declines. If you're not providing him with a home and fare, then yeah. So, but I think it is really true. I think it's not a coincidence that emancipate, you're emancipated from minority, you're emancipated from slavery, that those things are, the language is the same. And, given the fact that slavery was understood as a household institution, that's not surprising. They are understood both as dependents in relationship to the household head. And people, it's very direct. Francis quoted one of the letters where, it's essentially, he is my property. One woman essentially says this. And there is an incredible sense of ownership. Now, whether or not these parents in their petitions, they're using legal arguments, they want to attain a specific aim. So whether or not they feel this way, or whether or not they're using those arguments to actually get the boy released, it's harder to say. But I think we tend to think of these, there's emotional parenthood, emotional attachment to your children, and then a kind of proprietary claim. We see those as completely inimical to one another. I don't think the 19th century folks saw it that way. I think that they thought that I mean, they relied on these boys. In a sense, they were dependent on the boys. So, their claims over the boys' labor is also connected to their affective feelings. So I think it's all tangled up together. And just the fact that they're talking that way doesn't mean that they're not, the ideas about sentimental love and attachment are not at play.
Right. And one of the appeals of enlistment for boys who were underage was that if they were in the Army, they could keep the wages that they earned, right? They didn't
absolutely
have to give them to their parents.
Right.
So we will take just a quick pause here. I'll throw it back to Angela, who has some promotional comments, and then we will go to the questions from the audience. Angela?
Great. Okay. So, thank you so much. This is so fascinating and really a lot to think about. And I see lots of questions showing up. So just a reminder that if you have questions, put them in the Q&A section, and they'll be answered after this. If you're around on campus, there are a couple more weeks to see our current exhibit, which was co-curated with students. And that exhibit is Living Photography, Finding Film History in the Archive. Our open exhibit hours are noon to 4, Monday through Friday. And we do also have some upcoming tours if you would like a behind the scenes look at the Clements Library, along with the opportunity to visit the exhibit. You can also see the exhibit online if you are a little further afield. So you can take a look at that as well. Your gifts are important to us. So if anyone is interested in sponsoring a future episode of the Bookworm, I would be delighted to talk with you. So you can drop me a note and respond to one of the emails that I send out. In addition, we are so appreciative of all of you who take the time to log in person and participate in the chat and ask good questions, as well as everyone who gets the recording and watches it later. So thank you so much for being a part of the community in whatever way you participate. Please feel free to share this community with others that may be interested in these programs. Next month, we are delighted to host Alex Berenger to talk more about lost literacies, experiments in the 19th century US comic strip. And Alex did use some research from the Clements Library to inform this work. So that will be exciting. Since you are already signed up, you'll receive a reminder a day before and an hour before if you would like to log in to watch and participate live on that Friday morning. Otherwise, you will, just like today, receive an email with the resources mentioned during the broadcast and a link to the recording. All right, so up to you.
All right. So we have a lot of really interesting questions here. We have one about whether or not boys brought childhood infectious diseases into military camps when they enlisted.
It was really the other way around. They succumbed to diseases that were in the camps. This is part of the reason why people are so concerned about youth enlistment, is that especially boys from farms, many of them did not have immunity to, what even then were called the diseases of childhood. And there are many tragic cases of boys just coming to camp and dying 3 weeks later. So, yeah, it was definitely a problem, a sense that, there was a real vulnerability there.
Yeah. There's another question that there's a chapter about in the book that's a really interesting topic. So were many young people in the Union Army immigrants or from immigrant families, and did enlisting in the Army give immigrants a path to citizenship?
Yes. You were supposed to only be enlisted in the Union Army if you were a citizen or if you declared your intent to become a citizen, right? So there are many immigrants who enlist. There are also immigrants who are essentially impressed. Things get so bad in terms of the demand for manpower that the union sends, recruiters to Europe and tries to get people to sign on, sometimes with promises that are pretty iffy. They also meet ships at the dock and basically, including people who don't speak English very well, promise them bounties, and the next thing you know, you're signed up and in a union uniform. And of course, the young, they're doing this across the board, but of course, the young may be especially vulnerable or susceptible to that kind of heavy-handed approach to enlistment. So definitely we see cases of immigrants enlisting, immigrants, and it's also likely that immigrants are, many of them are on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, and as the war progresses and bounties in the North rise ever higher, and the cost of hiring a substitute, the price people will pay for someone who will serve as a substitute, also goes higher. There are these economic incentives that are really powerful. And, it's the poor who are both most vulnerable. We have cases of young people who they have family members who pretty much force them to enlist to get the bounty. We also have cases in which, the bounties are stolen off of them. But yeah, there's definitely many immigrants, and it is, of course, a path to citizenship.
Yeah.
Yes, military service.
So we have a couple questions about kind of your research methods. So Bill asks, given that recruits were required to state their ages, and how frequently that was falsified, how did you come to your estimate of 10% underage recruits? And Linda wonders if you tried to determine the proportion of underage enlistments that were actually endorsed by parents. And if so, did you look at why they endorsed those enlistments?
Yes, in regard to the second question, that is fairly small after February of 1862. In February 1862, Francis mentioned this law that basically said we won't take anybody under 18 unless you're a musician. So you had to say you were 18, and you couldn't, through parental consent, have that waived. In terms of how we figured out it's 10 to 11% actually, we basically did our own regimental study. We took all the 18-year-olds from a particular New York regiment and traced them. Not everyone we could find age that we felt confident about, but in the majority of cases we could, and basically half the 18-year-olds lied about their age. And you can, this has been staring people in the face for a long time. If you look at, 18-year-olds were the single largest category of enlistees by far. And, there's no logical reason why 18-year-olds would have been more patriotic than a 19-year-old, right?
Not how demography works, right?
Not right. So, it's actually not so surprising when you look at that. But the other thing we did, we actually hired a mathematician to help us with this. There's an amazing database called the Early Indicators Project that takes, I think it's like around 40,000 Union soldiers. It's representative of all these different areas and states, and they have done extensive research on tracing each soldier, and we had him. It's for someone like us, it's kind of complicated to use, which is why we sought help, but it's an amazing resource. And he ran the numbers on the database and basically came up with this 10 to 11% number, which reflected what we had not only found in our own, we also did the study of a Minnesota company, and other people are doing this now that it's much easier with Ancestry and other digital tools to trace folks. So, other folks, we cite all these other regimental studies where people have found similar, they've come up with similar numbers.
Sure. So we have a batch of questions that are about the actual experiences of underage soldiers in the war. I think the common image is that a lot of underage enlistees were drummer boys. That's the image that we have. How many underage soldiers worked as drummers or musicians? How many of them were actually, in combat? And are there a lot of first-person accounts of miners' experiences in the war, either sort of in the moment or published later, that are maybe more positive about the experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have an actual number I can tell you, but the vast majority are not enlisting as musicians. They are enlisting as regular soldiers. The musicians, of course, are some of the ones who they give their age honestly, right? Because you were allowed to enlist if you were 12 and up. So basically, the experience is pretty much the experience of regular soldiers for the majority of them. There are ways in which they're clearly being dealt with a little bit differently. And you can see this, many who enlisted as underage boys later wrote memoirs and discussed what happened. Of course, you have to view those with somewhat skeptical eyes in some cases, but other memoirs, it's like the level of idiosyncratic detail, they're pretty revealing. And we do have letters to people back home. And another kind of amazing source is some people who had trouble getting pensions because of their age looked suspicious, or they gave different ages. Their survivors actually sent letters that they had written during the war to Washington, D.C., and those end up in their pension files. So some of those are the most remarkable letters of all. But basically, there are plenty of sources, and it's clear that some of them, the other thing about musicians versus regular soldiers is this is a more fluid category than we thought. A lot of, there are cases in which a drummer writes home to his mother and says, my drum got bursted. He says it got bursted and I'm now in the ranks, basically, that many of them who start out as drummers end up becoming just regular privates. So I think that there are sort of informal practices. It's almost like an apprenticeship. They're taken under the wing of older men many times. Sometimes if they're particularly frail or weak, they're given other jobs. They're assigned to hospital duty. They're basically serving as a personal manservant to an officer. There are lots of cases like that where they're not doing the hard work of soldiering. But I think it's sort of like this all gets figured out the way it would have on a farm. Like, what is he capable of? What can he handle?
And I would say that you do a really wonderful job in the book of underscoring how traumatizing it would have been for anybody, but especially a boy, to be assigned duty in a Civil War hospital, and sort of what that involved. So we are past 11 o'clock, and I just have one last question to ask you, since we have a lot of folks from Michigan in our audience here. Can you tell us a bit about the story of Johnny Clem?
Yes, I can. Although I can't tell you as much as I would like. I hope someone does like a real rigorous academic study of him at some point, because the story of Johnny Clem is still wrapped up in all this mythology, and separating out fact from fiction is really difficult. We know he is from Ohio. He first tries to, as a little boy below 10 years old, tries to enlist in an Ohio regiment. That doesn't work out. He then enlists ultimately in a Michigan regiment, but first just tags along. And this, I think, happened not infrequently, where, boys who were, sometimes like stepkids who were having really hard time at home, and in Johnny Clem's case, it's often portrayed as this plucky boy, but there'd been a lot of tragedy in his family. He'd seen his mother die a grisly death. She was hit by a train near their property, and he just took off, and stays with this regiment. The story is that the soldiers basically chipped in to they got him a uniform, they rigged him up with a uniform, and they chipped in to feed him and give him a little money. And then after, it took a while, it was over 2 years later that he had proved his worth enough that he then is properly enlisted in the regiment. After the war, a grant tries to get him into West Point. The fact that he had not been in school all this time meant that he couldn't pass the exams. He does ultimately go to high school and graduate from high school, but never does get into West Point, but is still made an officer. Spent his entire career in the military, most of it in the quartermaster department. But I think it's very interesting the ways in which, he even a young child like that, his military service and his service on the battlefield was celebrated during the Civil War, whereas the darker aspects of that story, the fact that his sister was looking for him desperately, and they thought he was dead for years, like those kinds of the pain of family separation, elements don't usually make it into the narrative of Johnny Clem. So.
Yeah. And as someone who has a 9-year-old son at home, reading the story of this boy who leaves home at 9 to join the Michigan regiment to fight in the Civil War is particularly heartbreaking. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for talking with us about this fantastic book. And I was wrong. There isn't a discount code, but you should buy it anyway. Pay full price. It's really great.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm so glad that you joined us, and thank you, Paul, and Angela, for having me.
Yeah. Great. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend.